What's up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. On today's video, I'm gonna show you some of the steps that I took to remove the engine out of this third generation Toyota Tundra. Obviously, I won't be able to capture everything because I'm filming this myself, but I'm gonna show you some of the key components that you need to remove if you are to remove the engine out of these trucks. Of course, I don't expect this to be a DIY kind of video, but I just wanted to show you guys what's involved. So one of the first thing I like to do is remove the engine hood out of the way because it makes it so much easier to get access to that cowl panel right there towards the windshield. With that hood in the way, the angle of the hood makes it so hard to reach back there and start taking out the wiper arms and the cowl panel. Here you can see that it's just so much easier with the hood out of the way. Now you got your wiper motor, the cowl tray. Once you have that removed, it makes it easier also to get access to components behind the engine. As you guys can see, there's so much room. With so many things connected to this engine inside of the engine bay, it's not exactly a DIY job that you want to tackle on at the house. But with a shop, lift, and some equipment, it's not exactly the most difficult engine to remove either. Here you have your coolant reservoir for the intercooler and the engine. It looks like it's one reservoir, but it's actually for two different cooling systems. The one that I'm removing right now is for the engine. So I like to remove these caps so that way the coolant can bleed out easier with the help of gravity. So now the one that I'm twisting off right now is for the intercoolers. Like I said, one reservoir, but for two different cooling systems. So now we're underneath the truck. One of the first thing we want to do is drain the oil out of the engine. We don't want to send the engine back to Toyota with oil in there. That's one of the requirements they ask of us. And you're going to see this little engine cover here with two 12mm bolts. Remove that, and it's going to expose the radiator petcock to drain out the coolant. The one with the yellow tab is for the engine, and then you're going to see one towards the front of the bumper with a white tab. That's for the intercooler and turbos. So that reservoir that I showed you, remember I said it was one reservoir, but two different cooling systems. So the one with the yellow is for the engine, and the one with the white is for the intercooler. And all I'm doing is connecting a hose, so that way, once I loosen it up, the coolant can drain into the coolant drain bucket there. So even if you guys are changing your own antifreeze at the house, this is the step that you would want to take to drain out the coolant from the system. Fairly easy, and they make it really accessible for DIY kind of guys out there who want to do these kind of things themselves. So that's what I'm doing right now, draining out the coolant from the system. While underneath the truck, I'm gonna start off by removing the two catalytic converters, one from each bank. And I have this front drive shaft here that's connected to the front differential to the rear transfer case. That also needs to be removed. 4 14mm nuts that's bolting it on to the front differential, and as well as 4 14mm nuts to the transfer case. Now I'm gonna make my way towards the wheel housing liner. When you remove the tire, this little cover right here is gonna be your best friend. It gives you so much room and access to so many components, the turbos and the 17mm bolts around the bell housing for the transmission. So you definitely wanna get this cover off because like I said, so many things will be exposed once you do that. Even the air fuel ratio sensors that you will need to unplug. Now to get this cat off, there's a 14mm nut behind that brace, and then the two 14mm bolts connecting it to the rest of the exhaust pipe. Those will need to be removed on both sides. Now that I got the cover out from the wheel housing liner, you guys can see more things are exposed now, such as the air fuel ratio sensor before the catalytic converter, a couple heat shields, and that 12mm nut that you saw around the clamp. So I'm gonna get my 12mm socket and a ratchet, loosen up that nut that you see there that's clamping on the pipe that's bolted onto the turbo. So that 12mm nut needs to be removed. So it's pretty much like a clamp kind of style setup for both banks, for the left side and passenger side as well. Once that nut is off, I can loosen up this clamp. And Toyota actually sent us new clamps and a couple other new seals for this repair. So this clamp right here will not be reused. As you can see, once I did that, you could see the catalytic converter starting to separate from the turbo there. This is definitely a two-man job. So while you're up here through the wheel housing liner, you need somebody at the bottom to kind of help support it. So here you get a better visual while it's off the ground. You can see the two dowel pins there. That's what's gonna line up on the turbo. So it makes it really easy for you to get the correct orientation when it's installed in the car. So now we have the catalytic converter out. As you can see, the bolts around the bell housing of the transmission is now exposed. So slowly but surely, that's the exhaust bracket there. So you can see the bolts going there, and you can see the wastegate valve on the turbo open. And you see these little holes there. That's where the dowel pins on the catalytic converter will mount to. And then with the help of the clamp and the 12mm nut, everything is secured nice and tight. Got the 17mm bolts and the 14mm bolts around the bell housing. On the passenger side, I still have the catalytic converter to remove. So now we have that removed. More things is opening up. As you can see, similar concept for both sides. And once you get these pipes out of the way, guys, so many things is exposed. All the bolts are there. Now we're gonna make our way to the starter. Starter is not too difficult as well. Even without removing the pipes, you can still remove this starter. It makes it a little bit more challenging to get access to the bolts, but it's still possible to do it in the car. Now, before I remove the starter from the truck, one of the first thing I should have did was disconnected the negative terminal that's connected to the battery. You definitely want to do that anytime you're doing a starter or an alternator job. You don't want the battery connected at all. And why is that? Because you run the risk of starting an electrical fire. Because when it's time to disconnect this positive cable that's connected to the starter that feeds the starter the power that it needs to turn the engine over, you can actually create an electrical fire if your ratchet touched that. So here we have our 14mm bolt that's connected to the starter. And like I said, you definitely want to have the battery disconnected while doing this. So once we remove the starter, it gives us access to the flywheel bolts. So now you have the starter. I know my gloves is ripped. It's so hard to get your hand in these places without ripping your gloves. So many gloves I had to change out. So once the starter is removed, you see this little cover right here. This is gonna be important to remove as well because you see the opening of the starter. You can see the flywheel bolt there. I need that cover above that exposed because I'm not able to get access to that 17mm bolt that's holding on the flywheel to the torque converter. So with the help of another ratchet that's rotating the crank, I'm able to rotate the engine just enough so I can get to that opening right above that starter opening. So that's where I'm able to squeeze my 17mm ratchet to loosen up the torque converter bolts. And here we make our way towards the front of the car. I'm gonna need to remove this fan shroud. So we have a couple of transmission lines, cooler lines connected to it that I need to remove as well. And the fan shroud just sits on these tabs mounted on the radiator. So assembling it is a lot easier too. So we got a couple hoses that we're going to need to remove because now it's time to remove the fan shroud. Now we make our way back on top of the vehicle. I got my AC lines connected. While I'm doing this, I like to recover the refrigerant. It just saves me some time. Got a couple harnesses on top of the radiator that needs to come out, and the reservoir needs to come out as well to remove the fan shroud. So slowly but surely we're getting there. As you can see, now I got the transmission cooler lines disconnected from the fan shroud, and I got all my coolant drained out. Now I have the fan shroud removed from the front of the radiator, or behind the radiator, I should say. And it's opening up more room inside of the engine bay. I got the fan clutch out, the air box on both banks removed. Now I'm gonna start making my way to remove the harness. The harnesses that's connected to the fuse block. I just want to lay them on top of the engine because that's the only way you're gonna pull the engine out. Now towards the transmission, we have this harness that lays on top of the transmission that needs to be disconnected because while we pulling the engine out, it's going to pull this harness along with it. So we have to disconnect it on top of the transmission. It's fairly simple. It's easy to get access to. Now I got the 14mm bolts around the bell housing on the transmission removed. I also have the torque converter to flywheel bolts inside of the engine where you saw near the starter removed as well. And that opening around the wheel housing liner, like I said, that's where I get the other top bolts on top of the transmission. Now, after all of that, we're pretty much ready to remove this engine from this truck. So towards the driver's side, I have one engine hooked there, and we're gonna make our way to the passenger side, and you're gonna see another engine hook there as well, provided by Toyota. That's the only way you're gonna pick up this engine. So now I got the harness that's connected to the body on top of the engine, and towards the fuse block, that engine is disconnected as well, and the AC line is also disconnected. So now we are ready to pull this engine out. So now I'm gonna position myself, and to do this, guys, you do need a couple of experienced technicians helping you. So you need a technician on the passenger side, the driver's side, and even an extra one at the bottom to keep an eye on things, one operating the crane, and me in the front. So you definitely don't want to get an express or a tech apprentice to help you do this, because you need to be really careful. The engine is, one, heavy. Two, you don't want to damage the radiator in the front. You don't want to break the windshield pulling this engine out. So you need to have a lot of eyes on every corner of this engine to make sure nothing is getting pinched, nothing is getting caught. You are not pulling on the fuel line. You are not stretching the harness. So that's it. The more experienced people you have helping you to do this is better. So I'm just kind of wiggling it a little bit to make sure it's freed up from the engine mount, from the flywheel and torque converter. So all this is being done while being in constant communication with the guy operating the hoist. So many communication is happening here. So it just takes a little patience. You don't want to rush this. You want to take your time, be careful. You don't want to cause any extra damage in parts that Toyota's not going to cover. And if you do that, of course, it's going to come out of the dealership pocket. You're going to find yourself in the manager's office, and that's not what you want. So the more guys around this to help you, the better. And you can see the importance of this engine hoist. Before, we would have to disassemble the front of the radiator bumper, the radiator support, all that stuff. Now you don't need to. With the help of this new engine hoist, we are able to pick this engine right up. And just to give you a reference of how high I'm going to have to lift this engine up to clear that bumper, I stand about 6 feet 2 inches. So you're gonna see this engine's pretty much gonna be over my head as we're pulling it out of the truck. So we're just gonna make sure we keep an eye on it. And it's so much easier now that we don't have to tear this whole thing apart and rebuild it. Toyota made it really easy by just sending us a complete engine. So before, this would only been maybe 15% of the work, and we are already almost a days in. So to really remove this engine, it's about at least 6 hours worth of work. I mean, the more you get familiar with doing it, I'm sure some guys can do it a lot quicker. But for me, I'm about 6, 7 hours in right now. And like I said, I just like to take my time. I don't like to try to do these kind of jobs in one day. There are techs out there who wants to pull the truck in, take the engine out, and try to install the engine and have the truck running by the end of the same night. I don't get any reward for doing that. So I like to take my time, preserve my back and knees so I can go home and still have some energy left. So like I said, I'm 6'2", and you see how high this engine is above my head. Here we have some cardboard right behind the radiator to make sure it doesn't get scratched or nicked. We don't want to cause extra damage in parts that Toyota's not willing to pay for. So here we have the engine out of the engine bay. As you can see, the front of the radiator, the bumper is still intact, and got a little coolant in front of the bumper there, but the truck's gonna get detailed by the time we're done with this repair. This is a 4-wheel drive Tundra, so it's a little bit more crammed in there, but I didn't have to do nothing with the front differential other than to remove the front drive shaft, but it came out pretty simple. Like I said, if you have a lot of hands helping you do this, it's not so bad, but there need to be experienced eyes on every corner while doing this. So the transmission harness that was on the back of the transmission, you see how the engine comes out with it. So you need to also have a guy at the bottom making sure that harness is not getting tugged. It's not caught anywhere while you're lifting that engine out, because you're going to rip connectors and you're going to damage pins, and you're not going to know it until you try to start the car and drive it. All of a sudden you get some kind of transmission code or some kind of error. Now you got to go back trying to figure out what you did wrong. So it's better to just have the guys with experienced eyes helping you to do this. So now we're gonna have to take this engine harness and transfer it from this old engine to the new one. So far, that's pretty much what's involved. So much easier than having to rebuild this. Just a few components we need to transfer over: the alternator, the engine wiring harness, tensioners, and the drive belt. Those do not come with the engine. We got the pulleys that we need to transfer, the tensioner, like I said, the belt. So much easier than rebuilding the engine. So here we have the new engine ready to install in the truck. Well, not quite yet, because we still got the components to transfer over from the old engine. But man, talking about making things so much easier. This thing comes with new coils, new everything, new intercooler, anything that touches oil, it comes brand new in this new engine. It even comes with engine oil already inside of this engine. So we don't even have to pour any oil in it. This engine right now already has oil inside of it. So now I'm just making sure I transfer everything from the previous engine to the new engine. Now this step is crucial because once this engine is installed in the truck, there's very limited space for you to reach and connect connectors. So you want to make sure you have all your sensors, all your harness connectors are routed correctly. You do not want to find yourself in a situation where you have this thing mounted, installed in the truck, and then you're getting a open circuit code because you forgot to plug in a connector. And now the connector is behind the alternator. Now you got to remove the alternator while it's inside the truck and you were ready to start it. And now you have this malfunction light on. So the old saying, measure twice, cut once, is really crucial here at this point. So that's what I'm doing right now, just making sure I take my time. This is the new engine here that's set up on the engine hoist. I'm just double checking, triple checking everything, making sure I have all my connectors and sensors plugged in. All my bolts are tight, bolts to the compressor, my drive belt is routed correctly. I don't want to take extra time or waste any extra time after installing this engine trying to do it in the truck. It's easier to already do everything now while the engine is out of the truck, while I have all the room in the world and I can see everything. Everything is easily accessible. So the old saying here is really handy. Measure twice, cut once. So you just want to be focused. You don't want any distractions and just take your time. And it helps too. Before I even came to this step, I had the engines, the new one and the original one lined up side by side to help me to see what I need to transfer over. Like I said, you don't want to put this engine in and you miss a sensor from the old engine. So here we have the new engine ready to go. All the harnesses and wires have been transferred over, all the AC components, alternator, drive belt, everything has been transferred over to this new engine assembly. And now we are pretty much at the point where we're ready to install it back into the truck and do everything in reverse order. Now we have the engine on the hoist, getting ready to install it back in the truck. And you guys can see how high it is over that gentleman's head. Now the engine is installed in the truck. I got my 2 catalytic converter installed, connected to the turbos, drive shafts is installed. So we're getting ready to start this engine up real soon, guys. As you guys can see, new clamps is provided. I have my air fuel ratio sensors connected, wired up properly. I got my heat shields back on. So everything's looking good, guys. Again, through that wheel housing liner cover, it's crucial you have that thing removed. So everything looks good, nice and shiny. I'm sure this customer will be satisfied and happy with the repair and the engine replacement. Now making my way underneath the engine hood, we lowered the truck. Now it's time to reinstall some of the other components. As you can see, I have the radiator fan trowel connected, upper radiator hose already connected. I have the engine harness. Now I got the coolant reservoir connected to the fan trowel, getting ready to add some coolant in there. So far everything is going nicely, guys. I got my transmission cooler lines connected and routed to the engine. As you can see, it looks a lot more intimidating now because so many things are packed together, but it's really not that bad, guys. Lower radiator hose is connected, engine harness to the fuse block. Everything is looking good. So far, so good. And like I said, the fact that we don't have to do so many more work and having to rebuild this, It makes it a whole lot easier. Now it's time to add some coolant. So we're gonna use the old funnel style where we add coolant to the reservoir. And this coolant reservoir right here, or this funnel, is not the ideal way to bleed air out of this truck. This thing takes so much coolant for the engine. Even in the repair manual, Toyota provides us with 5 gallons of antifreeze for this truck. So what you're gonna need to make sure you bleed the air from the system is one of those air lifts that can vacuum down the system and put it into at least 16 or 25 inches of vacuum so you can really get all the air out from the heater core, the hoses, all in the engine block. And then you're gonna suck up the engine coolant from a gallon to make sure you have no air pockets in there so this engine does not overheat and all your hard work was for nothing. But we already did that. That's what I'm doing right now, making sure I top it off. I already did the vacuuming to make sure I got all the air pockets out. This is just little extra topping off that I'm doing. The last thing you want to do is do all this work and then you forgot to have sufficient amount of coolant. And now you go on a test drive and the engine overheats. And then who's going to pay for that claim? Who's going to pay for a new engine? Not Toyota. They only send you one. So they expect you to have it installed correctly and follow repair procedures so nothing goes wrong and you don't have to find yourself filing another claim. Since the truck starts and run, I'm able to flip the truck in my bay now. So now I'm just going to install the cowl panel, the tray system, the wiper arms, the wiper motor, everything that I did in the beginning of this video while the hood was off, because it's in my best interest to already do all these things now before I install the hood. As you can see, I'm 6'2" and I still got to stand on a chair just to reach by the windshield area. So it's better to do all of this while the hood is off. Otherwise, right now, my head would have been touching the top of the hood. So that's what I'm doing now. Everything in the reverse order that I did to remove the engine. So this was the first step that I did. Now it will be the last step that I'm doing to finalize this repair on this Tundra. So as you guys can see, it's not too bad. Toyota made it a whole lot easier now by providing us a new complete engine. So we don't have to tear it apart and break it down, and so many things can go wrong. And I'm not sure if every dealer have adequate technicians to do this kind of job and rebuild engines, especially for 100,000 plus trucks. And that's all she wrote, ladies and gentlemen. So now you guys know the steps that it takes to remove the engine out of one of these 3rd-generation Toyota Tundras. So hopefully it put your mind a little bit at ease. And I hope you found this video informative. And if you did, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. As always, thanks for watching.